But getting to what the point he makes about Nixon. He's wrong. Shocking fucking news. He's completely wrong about this Richard Nixon thing, right? He says that they paid him $18 million or his heirs, right? $18 million because of the Presidential Records Act. No, they didn't. It's not what happened. Not what happened at all. What he's mixing up, shocking news, is there's something called the Presidential Records and Materials Preservation Act, PRMPA, of 1974. That was passed, and it only applied to Richard Nixon, right? Because Richard Nixon was like, hey, man, I'm just going to go ahead and destroy these tapes. And they were like, the fuck you will. Hold on. We're going to pass this law, right? But it only applied to Nixon because of Watergate. However, the government had taken, like before that act had happened, presidents, anytime before that, presidents, whatever they created, like they wrote a note, whatever, that was their personal property. But they, most of the time, they would donate those properties to like the White House records people, right? Mm-hmm. And the archivists, and like, oh, these are notes I made, here it is for the presidential libraries, and, just for like posterity type of thing, right? That was just what presidents did, but it was technically their personal property. However, Nixon comes around, Watergate happens, he's like, maybe I should destroy these tapes. And they're like, slow down, we're going to pass this thing so that you don't, because this is the first time this type of shit has ever happened, or that we're aware of. Mm-hmm. And so that passed, right? The Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, right? So that passed in 1974 to stop Richard Nixon from doing what he did. However, later on in like the 90s, in 1992, the U.S. Court of Appeals and District of Columbia Circuit Court ruled that Nixon was entitled to compensation because basically they took all of his shit. And they were like, no, it's all under this record. So he was entitled to some compensation. Later on in 1978, they passed the Presidential Records Act, right? Which is what Trump said was passed against Nixon. That wasn't passed against Nixon, right? So basically, when that passed in 78, any president, that basically made it so that any president from 78 forward, right? Any president, all of their shit basically became public property, right? Which is how we look at it today. So this idea that Trump is like, well, under the Presidential Records Act, like I'm allowed to take anything, just like Richard Nixon did. No, Richard Nixon was a completely different thing. His shit was not under the Presidential Records Act. They passed a specific law to stop him from doing his dirt. So you can't, any president after 1978 already can't just take whatever they want and it's their personal shit because of the Presidential Records Act. So he doesn't understand fundamentally the difference, one, what happened to Nixon, because they did pay Nixon $18 million, right? But by the way, at the end of the day, between lawyers' fees and everything else, his daughters got to split $90,000 of that $18 million, right? So it wasn't like Nixon's like family was like, woo, $18 million. Like that's actually not what happened. His lawyers got like $7.5 million of that. So he fundamentally doesn't understand why Nixon got the $18 million paid out to him. And it's not because of the Presidential Records Act. That's not it at all. And that basically the act that they passed in 74, the PRMPA Act, basically was only for Nixon. And not only that, but it's kind of overshadowed by the Presidential Records Act. So don't listen to Trump about anything because he doesn't know shit about the stuff that even applies to him. Like, well, and fundamentally not to, very ignorant of all this shit.
And forgetting the fact that he's an idiot. So when he says when he's like, oh, they paid Nixon $18 million. So what are you implying? That you're hanging on to this shit in the hopes that the government's going to pay you out for it or something like that? Like, is that your implication?
It's like a weird, like you're pushing for like sort of an exploitative perspective. Right. It's very weird, but he's fundamentally wrong about that. Like, no, dude, they passed the Presidential Records Act like from basically from Reagan forward. No president can argue that anything they made or created or happened to them while president is their property. It literally isn't because of a law that was passed in 78. So Last time I checked, you were president after 1978. Ergo, this applies to you. So this shit is public. It's not private information. So again, if you hear Republicans or you hear Donald Trump very specifically say he's allowed to take whatever he wants, he literally is not. And that's what this federal case is about. But yeah, when he said that, I was like, $18 million of Richard Nixon. Immediately, my bullshit flag went up, and I was like, let me read up on this to see exactly what this is about. And it's actually, I link it. It's a factcheck.org article that's very good, and they actually link out to the GovTrack, bills and things, laws that were passed for the Presidential Records Act and everything else. So you can read up on all of that. It's in the docket. But no, he's lying. Not even lying. He's just wrong. Right? I think he thinks he's right. I don't think he thinks he's telling something that's false. I think he's just ignorant on it. Shocking news. So look, getting back to this, it is quintessential Donald Trump that the thing that he gets indicted on first is because he had to get his dick wet with a porn star. Of course. And not only that, he's cheap about it. Right? Like he's cheap about it. So he couldn't just have sex with her, do the hush money payment. He got to get compensated too.